There is a kind of silence that does not feel like silence. It feels like wait, like the moment just before something breaks, except nothing breaks, nothing falls, nothing shifts. The room holds itself completely still, and yet something inside it has already changed, in a way that no one in the room can name yet. That kind of silence is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a shift in the air, or a change in expression, or a sudden drop in temperature. It arrives quietly, unremarkably. The way a door closes behind someone who has already left the building. You hear it, you register it, and then you continue with whatever you were doing, because there is nothing to react to. Not yet. Not for a long time. There is a man who experienced that silence once. He did not know it was happening while it happened. That is the nature of certain moments. They do not reveal themselves at the time of their occurrence. They reveal themselves later, in fragments, in the slow, uncomfortable drift of recollection that arrives when the noise of the day has quieted and something in the mind begins to turn things over again, looking for nothing in particular and finding something it would have preferred not to find. This is the story of that man, and of the moment that did not correct him, and of the long, quiet time after. The man's name does not matter for this telling. What matters is what he believed, and how he carried that belief, and what happened when that belief was neither confirmed nor denied by the one person whose response he had been, without fully realizing it, waiting for all along. He had studied for years, not casually, not with the loose interest of someone who enjoys something and returns to it occasionally. He had studied with the kind of commitment that reshapes a person, that takes what they were and adds something dense and layered to the center of them, something that changes the way they stand and the way they think and the way they hear conversations about the thing they have given themselves to. He had trained in martial arts since he was young enough that the memory of beginning had blurred into the memory of simply always having done it. The discipline was not separate from him. It was woven through him. It showed in how he moved, in how he held himself when he was standing still, in how he oriented his body when he entered a room, with a kind of quiet readiness that was not aggression, but was not quite ease either. It was something in between, something practiced and particular. He knew what he knew. He knew it the way people know things that they have tested with their bodies, not just their minds. He had been in rooms where these ideas were proven or disproven in real time, where the concepts he carried had been put into contact with resistance and pressure and had held. He did not believe his understanding casually. He had earned it, in the specific way that physical disciplines require things to be earned through failure and correction and repetition and occasional brief moments of clarity that justified everything before and after them. He was confident, not in the brittle way of people who have not been tested, in the settled way of someone who has been tested often enough to know where his understanding is solid and where it is less so, and who believes, on this particular subject, that he is on solid ground. He was in a room with others. There were people around him, not a crowd, but enough. People who knew the field, people whose opinions had weight, the kind of room where what you say is heard and remembered and quietly evaluated, not in any hostile way, but in the way that serious people evaluate serious things said in serious company. The kind of room where being wrong does not hurt you in the moment, because the moment passes smoothly, but where the gap between what you said and what was true eventually finds a way of returning. He was speaking about technique. The specific contours of what he said are not the point. The point is that he said it with knowledge, with precision, with the particular cadence of a person who has thought about something deeply and is now giving that thought form in language, shaping it for an audience, choosing the words that carry the most of what he means with the least distortion. He explained the mechanics. He traced the line of reasoning. He used the right language, not the language of someone who has read about a thing, but the language of someone who has done a thing and reflected on it and built an understanding from the inside out. The room listened. People nodded, not enthusiastically. This was not a room for enthusiasm, but they tracked what he was saying. They followed the logic. They indicated, in the small and controlled ways that people in such rooms indicate things, that they were receiving what he was transmitting. He felt this. The feeling was not intoxicating. He was not the kind of person who needed applause or validation in any obvious way. But there is a particular satisfaction in being understood, in having a complex idea received clearly, in feeling the comprehension on the other side of what you are saying. He felt that. It was quiet and familiar and reassuring. And then he became aware of something. Not a sound, not a movement, not any disruption of the room's tone or texture, just an awareness, a peripheral sense of presence. He did not turn to look immediately. He continued. He completed the point he was making. He let the sentence finish. He let the thought land. And then, in the natural pause that followed, he glanced to the side. Bruce Lee was in the room. He had been there for how long was unclear. Long enough to have heard what had been said. Long enough to have been present for the explanation. Long enough for his presence, once noticed, to retroactively color everything that had preceded the noticing. He was standing with the ease of someone who is entirely comfortable in their own stillness. Not relaxed in a careless way, there was nothing careless about him, but settled, present, contained. He was not looking at the man who had been speaking. He was looking at nothing in particular at the middle distance, at some neutral point in the room, in the way people look when they are listening without wanting to appear to be listening too intently. The look of someone who is receiving information and processing it internally rather than visibly. He said nothing. The man who had been speaking registered his presence, acknowledged it in the brief and understated way the moment seemed to call for, and continued. There was no reason not to. Nothing had happened. The room was the same. The conversation was the same. The people were the same. There was simply, now, one additional person in the room, and that person had offered nothing to indicate that anything in the preceding conversation warranted a response. So the man continued. He completed his thought. He moved to the next point. He was thorough but not excessive, he said, what needed to be said, and did not labor it. He was, by any reasonable measure, performing exactly as he always performed in such settings. Clear, informed, confident without being loud about it. And throughout all of this, Bruce Lee said nothing. He did not nod. He did not object. He did not ask a question. He did not tilt his head in the way that indicates either agreement or confusion. He simply remained present. There is a particular quality to the presence of someone who truly understands something. It is different from the presence of someone who is still learning. It is different from the presence of someone who disagrees. It is different, even, from the presence of someone who agrees. It is something else entirely, a kind of quiet completeness, a density of comprehension that does not require expression, because the understanding is already total, already settled, already at rest inside the person who carries it. Whether the man registered this quality in that moment is uncertain, but it was present. The conversation continued for some time. Other people spoke. Other points were made. The room moved through its natural progressions. The way rooms of that kind do. A topic is introduced, examined, circled, arrived at from different angles, and eventually allowed to settle into the common understanding that becomes the room's conclusion for the evening. Bruce Lee contributed occasionally, briefly, in the measured way of someone who speaks when there is something worth adding and remains quiet when there is not. What he said was not remarkable for its volume or its certainty. It was remarkable for something else, for the way it seemed to arrive from a place of complete simplicity, as if the thing he was describing was obvious once you had seen it clearly enough, and the only reason it might not appear obvious to someone else was because they had not yet seen it with that particular clarity. He never addressed the man directly. He never referenced what the man had said. He never, in any observable way, signaled that anything had been said that required addressing. The evening continued, and then it ended. People moved. The room's configuration shifted from gathered to departing. The density of conversation thinned, became more fragmented and personal, the large shared topic dissolving into small side exchanges between people who knew each other, brief acknowledgements between people who did not. The man moved through this transition normally. He exchanged words with people around him. He concluded conversations in the standard way. He was not distracted or diminished. He had nothing specific to feel distracted or diminished by. The evening had been, by any visible measure, entirely unremarkable in its outcome. He had spoken. He had been heard. The room had continued. Nothing unusual had occurred. Bruce Lee left without ceremony. No particular acknowledgement, no extended goodbye, no moment that announced itself as significant. He was simply, at some point, no longer in the room. And then the evening concluded, and the man went home, and the night passed in the way that nights pass when there is nothing pressing to attend to easily, without interruption, in the ordinary progression of fatigue to sleep, and that would have been the end of it. Except that it was not. The first signal was small. It was not a thought, not a clear and articulable recollection. It was closer to a sensation, a brief, very quiet sensation of something unresolved, something left open, something that had not quite completed its circuit. It arrived the following morning. He was not thinking about the previous evening. He was occupied with the ordinary texture of a new day, the small decisions and movements that fill the early hours, the gradual accumulation of presence and orientation that constitutes a person coming back to themselves after sleep. And somewhere in the middle of that, it appeared, not as a memory with edges and detail, as a tone, as a faint and uncertain quality, a residue from the night before that did not attach itself to any specific image or moment, but simply existed as a kind of atmospheric remainder, hovering just at the edge of his attention. He did not examine it. There was nothing to examine, really. Nothing had happened that warranted examination. He continued with his morning. He did what mornings require, but the quality persisted. It was not uncomfortable. Not yet. It was simply present in the way that certain things are present without being invited. The way a sound you have heard before appears faintly in your consciousness when you are in a room that held it once. Not because the sound is there now, but because something in your memory has associated the space with the sound and offered the association without asking. He went through the day. The day was full, in the way days are full, occupied, sequential, requiring his attention in segments, work, and then movement, and then the smaller mechanics of an ordinary afternoon. He was present for all of it. He was not distracted in any obvious way. But there were moments. Moments when, in the brief spaces between tasks, the transition between one thing and the next, the pause before beginning something new, the tone from the morning returned, still faint, still without edges, still without a name or a specific reference point. But there, by the time evening came, he had noticed it. Not dramatically, not with any alarm, simply the quiet acknowledgement that something was returning with enough regularity to qualify as persistent. Something about the previous night had not fully settled. Something had been left in a state of incompletion that his mind, for reasons it had not yet communicated to him, was reluctant to leave unattended. He allowed himself to return to it, not with urgency, with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that some things require space to become clear, that the attempt to force clarity too early often produces only the appearance of clarity, a surface explanation that resolves the discomfort of not knowing without actually resolving the underlying uncertainty. He let the evening come back. The room, the people, the texture of the conversation, the way the words had felt as he was speaking them, steady, confident, built on ground he believed was solid. The way the room had received those words, the small signals of comprehension and engagement. And then he allowed himself to remember the moment of awareness, the peripheral sense of presence, the glance to the side. Bruce Lee, standing with that particular quality of settled stillness, looking at nothing in particular, he stayed with this image for a moment, longer than he expected to. There was something in it, something he could not quite locate. He moved through the image slowly. He let himself notice details he had not consciously attended to at the time. The quality of the attention Bruce Lee had been paying to the room, the way he had oriented himself not toward any specific person or any specific conversation, but toward everything at once, with a kind of diffuse receptivity that missed nothing. The way he had been present without making his presence felt. The way his stillness had been complete without the quality of restraint, as if stillness was simply the natural state of someone with nothing to perform. And then he arrived at something, not a clear thought, not an articulated idea, more like a region of uncertainty, a place in his recollection where something felt slightly different from how he would have expected it to feel. It was in how Bruce Lee had received what he was saying. He had not reacted. This was not unusual in itself. The room had been measured in its responses. The people there were not given to theatrical engagement. Measured reception was the norm. But there is a difference between the measured reception of someone who has understood and agreed, and the measured reception of someone who has understood and is simply present, not agreeing, not disagreeing, but inhabiting a position that exists beyond the binary of agreement and disagreement altogether. He could not have named this distinction in the moment, but sitting with it now, in the quiet of a later evening, he could feel it. There had been no agreement in Bruce Lee's stillness, not because there was disagreement, but because whatever Bruce Lee was holding in his understanding was larger, somehow, more settled, of a different order than the one the conversation had been operating in, and he had said nothing. He had offered nothing to suggest that what was being said was incorrect. He had offered nothing to suggest it was correct. He had simply been present and received it, and allowed it to pass without any of the interventions that would have marked it as either confirmed or in need of correction. That absence of intervention was beginning to mean something. It was beginning to mean something that the man had not wanted it to mean when the evening was fresh and uncomplicated. Had not wanted it to mean because in the moment the absence of correction had felt like the absence of a problem, had felt, without ever being explicitly interpreted as such, like a kind of confirmation by silence. But it had not been. He understood this now, in the tentative, uncomfortable way that certain understandings arrive not all at once, not with clarity, but with a quality of increasing inevitability. The way a shape in the fog becomes a thing. You don't see it suddenly, you see it gradually, and then at some point you cannot pretend you have not seen it. The absence of correction had not been confirmation. It had been something else. It had been, he searched for the right way to hold this, it had been a kind of generosity, perhaps. Or perhaps not generosity. Something older and more neutral than generosity. Something that simply did not see the correction of every error as a necessary or useful act. Bruce Lee had understood something that the room had not. He had understood it quietly, in the way you understand things that have been in your body long enough to stop requiring thought. He had understood it, and he had said nothing. And the reason he had said nothing was not that there was nothing to say. It was that the moment was not the moment for saying it. or that the saying of it would not have produced the understanding that the saying seemed to promise, or, and this was the possibility that the man was finding most difficult to sit with, that the understanding was not something that could be given, it was something that had to be arrived at by the person who needed it, in the particular way that particular person needed to arrive at it. He sat with this for a long time. He did not move quickly through it. There was a part of him that wanted to minimize what he was feeling, to locate the specific element of his explanation that had been incomplete or imprecise, to define it clearly, to assess its significance, to determine that it was small, to place it in the appropriate category of minor errors that all people who know things well still occasionally make, and to allow that categorization to settle the matter. But another part of him recognized that this impulse toward minimization was itself a response to discomfort, that the rush to define and assess and categorize was, in this instance, a way of avoiding something rather than approaching it. What he had said had not been entirely wrong. That was the uncomfortable part. If it had been entirely wrong, the discomfort would have been simpler. He could have named it clearly and corrected it clearly, and the matter would have resolved with the cleanness of a straightforward error acknowledged and understood. But it had not been entirely wrong. It had been limited. It had been built on a foundation of understanding that was genuine, that was earned, that held for the range of situations he had tested it against. But it had been offered as if it were complete, as if the range he had tested it against were the full range, as if the solid ground he had found were the entire ground, rather than a section of it, a section large enough to build on, real enough to stand on, but not the whole of what was there. And Bruce Lee, who knew the whole of what was there, or who at least knew vastly more of it than had been visible in the conversation, had listened and had remained present and had allowed the moment to pass. There is something about that which does not resolve quickly. If someone had said, in the moment, that what the man was offering was partial, even gently, even respectfully, even with the care that good correction takes when it is genuinely offered in the interest of the person being corrected, there would have been a path through it, a moment of reorientation, a conversation, questions asked and answered, the particular recalibration that follows a clear and honest encounter with the edge of what you know. None of that had happened. There had been no edge offered, no boundary drawn, no indication that what was solid ended where the man believed it ended, or extended further, or was in some way different from the shape he had given it in his telling. There was only silence where a correction might have been. And now, days after the evening, that silence was doing something that no correction could have done. It was teaching, not quickly, not clearly, not in the way instruction teaches, with defined steps and identifiable progress. In the way that certain absences teach by creating a space that the mind must fill, and filling it imprecisely, and returning to fill it again, and finding that the new filling is better than the previous one, but still not right, and returning again, and continuing this process over a longer time, and with a deeper quality of attention than any single corrective exchange would have required. He was beginning to understand what he had not understood, not because anyone had told him, because the absence of being told had made him look. He thought about the way he had spoken. He thought about the confidence in his voice, not false confidence, but the confidence of someone who genuinely believes the territory they are describing is the territory, who has lived in a portion of it long enough to know it well, and who, in the knowing, has gradually, without meaning to, allowed the known portion to fill the space where the unknown portion also exists. He thought about how natural this is, how it happens not through any failure of honesty but through the structure of the thing itself, that understanding any complex territory always means, at some point, operating as if the understood portion is the whole of it. Because otherwise the complexity is paralyzing. Because otherwise you cannot act, cannot speak, cannot train, cannot teach, cannot progress through the levels of a thing if every moment requires you to hold simultaneously everything you know and everything you do not know. But there is a difference between necessarily treating the known as sufficient and forgetting that the unknown exists. He had been, in that room, in some proximity to the second thing. Not entirely. He had not been careless or arrogant, but he had been settled, in a way that was not quite the same as certain, in a way that had softened, over time, into something close to certainty. The softening had been gradual enough that he had not noticed it happening. The settling had felt like depth rather than limitation. He understood now that it had been both. The depth was real. The limitation was also real. And the limitation did not diminish the depth. But the depth did not eliminate the limitation either. Both were true simultaneously. Both had to be held simultaneously, and the holding of both is a different posture than the one he had been standing in. Bruce Lee had known this, had known it in the way that you know things when they have moved entirely from the level of thinking into the level of being. When a truth has been inside you long enough and worked on you thoroughly enough that it no longer requires articulation even to yourself. When you simply are the understanding rather than having it. That kind of knowing does not correct. It does not correct because it does not need to. It does not correct because the correction would be a step backward, a translation of something that exists beyond language back into language, necessarily losing fidelity in the translation. It does not correct because the person most in need of correction is not yet at a place where the correction would be received at the level it needs to be received. The words might arrive, the concept might be registered, but the understanding, the bone level, body level, practice level understanding cannot be given. It can only be grown. And so Bruce Lee had been silent, not dismissively, not cruelly, not because the man was unworthy of correction or unworthy of engagement, but because silence was, in this case, the more accurate gift. The man did not find this comforting. He had not been looking for comfort, and he did not find it. What he found was something more complicated and less easily dismissed, a widening sense of his own edges, a feeling of the perimeter of what he knew, which he had not felt as a perimeter before because he had been standing in the middle of it. And from the middle, the edges of a thing do not always reveal themselves. He was not crushed by this. He was not unmade by it. He was, in the deepest way, simply quieter. The kind of quieter that happens when you have been given a real thing to think about, not a problem to solve, not a puzzle to complete, not a challenge to overcome, but a genuine expansion of the space you are working in. When the territory you thought you knew becomes suddenly, clearly, larger than you knew it to be. When the horizon you had been walking toward reveals itself as a middle distance with more horizon beyond. That kind of quieter does not go away quickly. He trained differently in the days that followed. Not dramatically, no sudden overhaul of approach or method, but with a different quality of attention, a quality that was slightly less settled, slightly less conclusive, a quality that held things more lightly, not skeptically, not with doubt that eroded what he had built, but with a kind of porousness, a willingness to let more in. He noticed things he had not noticed before. Small things, moments in training where the approach that had always served him still served him, but in a slightly different register where the thing that worked also revealed, in its working, the edges of where it stopped working, where the solidity of the known technique made visible, by contrast, the places where the technique encountered something it was not designed for and either adapted or faltered. He had seen these moments before. He had seen them and integrated them and moved on, folding them into his existing understanding in a way that enlarged the understanding without fundamentally challenging it. He was doing something different now. He was staying in the moments longer, not analyzing, not immediately integrating, just remaining present with the place where something met its limit, allowing himself to feel the limit clearly, to know the shape of it, to understand not just where the thing worked, but where the thing did not work, and to give equal weight to both. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Most people, when they encounter the edge of what works, move quickly through it in one direction or another. They either extend the technique, push through the limit, treat it as a temporary boundary, work harder to make the thing that almost works fully work, or they retreat from it, filing the limit as an exception, an anomaly, a case that falls outside the general rule. What is harder, much harder, is to stand at the limit and simply know it. To say, here is where this ends, not as a failure, not as an exception, as a fact, as part of the honest and complete geography of the thing. Here is where this technique has power. Here is where that power becomes something else, or diminishes, or transforms into a different kind of engagement entirely. Here is the edge, and from the edge, you can see things you cannot see from the middle. He was beginning to understand this. Not fully. Not in the way that Bruce Lee understood it. That kind of understanding takes years and particular conditions and a quality of attention that is not learned in a single season of unsettlement. But the beginning of it, the beginning of knowing that the depth of something and the limit of something are not opposed truths. That knowing both together is a more accurate and more useful knowledge than knowing only one. That the expert who can describe the limit of their expertise is demonstrating something more sophisticated than the expert who cannot see where their expertise ends. He thought about the conversation. He thought about it not with regret. Regret was not the right response to something that had no malice in it, that had simply allowed him to encounter his own boundary naturally. He thought about it with a kind of attention that was becoming, slowly, the specific thing the experience was trying to teach. He thought about what he would say if the moment occurred again. Not to correct the past, to understand the future. He would say less. Not because the knowledge was less, but because the knowledge was more. More aware of its own edges, more honest about what it could and could not carry, more willing to live inside the uncertainty of the large territory rather than the false comfort of the smaller, fully mapped one. He would leave more space. Space for the unknown to be present alongside the known without threatening it. Space for the conversation to exist in the ambiguity that actually characterizes the field, rather than in the false clarity of someone who has reduced the ambiguity to something manageable by simply not including it. He would hold things more the way Bruce Lee held things, not with the performance of certainty, not with the performance of uncertainty either, with something quieter than both. Something that simply knows what it knows, and knows what it does not know, and does not feel the need to announce either with any particular force. Bruce Lee had never said anything. In all of this, in all the hours of reconsideration and slow realization, and the gradual expanding of what the man understood himself to know and not know, Bruce Lee had never said a word. He had not corrected. He had not confirmed. He had simply been present in the moment, and then been absent from it, and left nothing in the space between his arrival and his departure, except the quality of his understanding, which had been visible to anyone paying a certain kind of attention, and which had done its work without requiring anything as crude as language. There is a type of teaching that works this way. It is not the common type. The common type uses instruction, explicit, directed, corrective. It names the error. It offers the replacement. It guides the student from the wrong position to the right one through the particular path of knowing where they are and showing them where they should be. That type of teaching is valuable. It is efficient. For most things, in most stages of learning, it is exactly the right tool. But there is another type. The type that works by allowing the student to remain in their error long enough to begin to feel the shape of it from the inside. long enough for the error to reveal itself not through external correction, but through the internal pressure of the truth that the error is suppressing. Long enough for the realization to arrive not as something received from outside, but as something uncovered from within. This type of teaching requires patience. It requires a willingness to sit with someone else's incomplete understanding and not fix it. To watch someone operate inside a limitation and not point to the limitation. To trust that the limitation will reveal itself in time, in its own way, through the natural friction of a genuine practice meeting genuine resistance. Most people cannot do this, not because they lack knowledge, because they lack the particular kind of restraint that it requires, the restraint of not correcting what you know to be incomplete, the restraint of allowing the other person's process to unfold at its own pace, in its own direction, with its own particular shape of arrival. Bruce Lee, in that room, had done this. Whether it was conscious or simply the natural expression of who he was and how he moved through the world, this is not something that can be known from the outside. But the effect was the same. He had been present. He had received. He had allowed. And he had moved on. And what he left behind was working. Still working. Even now, in the quiet of a later time, when the specific details of the evening had softened at the edges and only the essential shape of it remained, even now, the thing it had started in the man was continuing, not finished, not resolved, not arrived at a clean conclusion that could be stated and set aside, still in motion, still turning over, still finding, in the turning, small new angles on things he thought he had looked at from every angle. This is the nature of certain encounters. They do not complete themselves in the moment of their occurrence. They seed something that grows in the dark, in the ordinary time after the extraordinary moment, in the long and unspectacular duration of days that are not marked by anything specific, but in which something specific is nonetheless happening, quietly, beneath the surface of the ordinary. The man had spoken with confidence in a room that contained someone whose understanding of the thing he was speaking about was of a different order entirely. He had not known this while he was speaking. He had begun to understand it afterward. The understanding was not finished. It would not be finished quickly. But it had begun in the particular way that certain things begin, not with a moment of clarity, not with a clear decision, not with any deliberate turning toward a new direction, but with a small and quiet sense of something not quite right, a fragment that didn't fit, a sentence that felt slightly off in the recollection, a question that formed without being asked. From this beginning, the larger understanding grows, not linearly, not on a predictable schedule, but inexorably, in the way that genuine reckonings with genuine knowledge are inexorable. They cannot be permanently denied, cannot be indefinitely deferred, cannot be held at the edge of awareness forever without eventually crossing the threshold into full recognition. He would arrive at a fuller understanding, not because someone corrected him, because someone didn't, because the absence of correction had left him without the easy resolution that correction provides. And in the absence of that resolution, he had been required to go looking himself, to do the slower, less comfortable, more ultimately valuable work of finding his own edges, of mapping his own territory with more honesty than he had previously brought to the mapping, of discovering, from the inside, what could not have been as effectively given from the outside. Bruce Lee had known this, had known it, or had embodied it, which is a form of knowing that surpasses the other kind, and he had offered it in the form of silence, a silence that was not empty, a silence that contained, for the person who eventually learned to hear it, everything that needed to be said. The room where it happened is now a long time ago. The conversation that occurred in it has blurred, in the man's memory, to its essential shape, the shape of someone speaking confidently about a thing, and someone else present who understood the thing in a way that went beyond what was being said, and the long quiet after, and the slow and particular change that came from that long quiet. The change is not dramatic. It is not visible in any obvious way. It lives in the quality of attention the man now brings to the things he does not yet know, in the way he holds the edges of his understanding with a kind of honesty, a kind of willingness, a kind of patience with incompleteness that was not there before and is there now. It lives in the way he speaks about what he knows, more carefully, more honestly, with more space for what he does not know to be present alongside what he does, acknowledged rather than compressed, included rather than erased. It lives in a certain quietness that entered him and did not leave, the quietness of someone who has understood something about the nature of understanding itself, that it is always partial, always bordered, always existing in relation to a larger territory that it does not fully include. That the person who knows this and holds it and allows it to remain present in everything they do and say is not diminished by the knowing, is expanded by it. This is what the silence gave him. And Bruce Lee, who gave it, never said a word. That is what remained. That is what endures. Not the moment itself, not the specific exchange, or the specific room, or the specific words that were or were not spoken, but the shape of what the silence left, the particular and unfinished quality of a realization that arrived too late to be useful in the moment it was needed, and arrived just in time to be useful in every moment after. That is how certain things teach. Without announcement, without instruction, without correction, they simply presence themselves in the room, and then they are gone, and the work begins.